The dust in the Wyoming air was a constant companion to Caleb O'Malley. It caked his clothes, settled in the lines of his face, and clung to his soul like a second skin. He stood on the porch of his half-finished cabin, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues, but he saw only the shadows. The O'Malley Ranch was a testament to his grit, a sprawling, untamed piece of land he'd wrestled from the wilderness. Yet it was empty. His hands, calloused from years of hard labor, felt a hollow ache. It had been 6 months since his brother Samuel had passed, leaving behind a legacy of debt and a ranch in disrepair. The town doctor had given him a grim warning. Without help, he'd lose everything. With a heavy heart, Caleb had written a letter to a mail-order bride agency in the East. He had asked for a simple, quiet woman, one who could manage a household and wouldn't be a burden. He had expected a frail girl, someone he could protect, a fragile presence to fill the deafening silence of the ranch. He hadn't expected the storm that was about to arrive. Amelia Hayes stepped off the stagecoach in the dusty one-street town of Redemption. Her worn leather satchel clutched tight. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held a fierce light. She had fled a life of suffocating expectations back east, a world of arranged marriages and societal cages. She wasn't seeking a husband to save her. She was seeking a new beginning, a place where she could breathe, a place where she could be herself. The letter she'd received from Caleb O'Malley was simple and direct, promising an honest man and a chance at a new life. It was a risk, a leap of faith into the unknown. Caleb was waiting by the saloon, his silhouette a stark figure against the golden light. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and rugged, with a face that seemed carved from granite. When their eyes met, a jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. He saw a woman who was anything but frail. She saw a man burdened by a past he couldn't shake. The silence was thick with unspoken words, a silent promise and a question. Would this new, unexpected reality be more than either of them had bargained for? The sun set on their first encounter, and the night brought with it a cold wind, a harbinger of the conflicts to come. The ride to the O'Malley Ranch was long and quiet. The two spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a mirror of the man beside her. As they neared the homestead, Amelia saw the full extent of Caleb's struggle. The cabin's roof was patched, the fence around the corral was in disrepair, and the barn leaned precariously to one side. A wave of empathy washed over her. This wasn't a man living in comfort. This was a man fighting to survive. Caleb showed her to a small, spare room, its only furniture a simple bed and a chest. "It's not much," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We can fix it." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch. "There's a lot to be done." He spoke of the work as if it were a separate entity, a force that demanded all of his time and attention. Amelia simply nodded. She had come prepared to work. Over the next few days, a silent, rhythmic existence began. Caleb would rise before dawn, working tirelessly on the land, his movements efficient and purposeful. Amelia, in turn, cleaned and organized the cabin. She repaired a leaking roof, mended torn clothes, and made meals from the meager supplies. Their communication was limited to practical matters, the need for more lumber, the location of the water well. But in the quiet moments, they observed each other. Caleb saw her competence and quiet strength. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes and the way he flinched at the mention of his brother. The ghost of Samuel O'Malley hung heavy in the air, a silent, unseen third party in their home. One evening, as Amelia was mending a pair of Caleb's torn trousers, he came in from the cold. He stood by the fire, his hands outstretched to the warmth, and for the first time, he broke the silence with a personal question. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his. "What did you expect?" she asked. He hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know," he said, the words heavy with a past he wasn't yet ready to share. But the unspoken truth hung in the air. He had expected a frail girl, but a strong beauty had come, and she was beginning to shake his soul. Their fragile peace was shattered a week later by the arrival of the Miller brothers, a notorious trio who ran the rival ranch on the other side of the valley. Jed, the eldest and the leader, was a burly man with a permanent scowl and a reputation for ruthless expansion. He rode up to the fence, his two brothers, Silas and Luke, flanking him like vultures. Caleb stepped out of the barn, his hand resting on the holster of his revolver. He had dealt with Jed Miller before, and it was never for a friendly chat. "Heard you got yourself a wife, O'Malley." Jed sneered, his eyes raking over Amelia, who stood in the doorway, her presence a silent challenge. "Brought a little woman out here to clean up your mess?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's my wife, Miller. You have no business here." Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This land, it's ours, O'Malley. You know that. We'll give you a chance to sell. Get out while you can." He pointed a gloved finger at the disheveled homestead. "This place is a joke. You won't last the winter." Caleb's voice was a low growl. "This land belongs to the O'Malleys. It always has, and it always will. Get off my property." The standoff was tense, the air thick with unspoken violence. Finally, with a final menacing glare, Jed turned his horse and rode off, his brothers following close behind. As the dust settled, Amelia walked over to Caleb, her face pale, but her resolve firm. "What was that about?" she asked. "They want the land," Caleb said, his gaze fixed on the fading silhouettes of the Millers. "They've been trying to force me out for years. They think I'm weak without my brother." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the vulnerability beneath his rugged exterior. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said. Amelia simply shook her head. "Don't be," she said, her voice steady. "We're in this together." The words hung between them, a declaration of a partnership forged not in love, but in the crucible of conflict. The tension with the Miller brothers settled into a simmering threat, a constant weight in the air. Caleb and Amelia threw themselves into their work, a silent, unspoken pact between them. They repaired the fence, mended the barn, and began to ready the ranch for the coming winter. Their days were long, their bodies weary, but a rhythm began to form, a shared purpose that slowly chipped away at the wall Caleb had built around his heart. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, trapping them inside the cabin. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain lashed against the windows. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the silence for the first time felt less like an absence and more like an invitation. Amelia was mending a saddle, and Caleb was sharpening a knife. The soft scraping of the whetstone was the only sound. "Your brother?" Amelia began, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to him?" Caleb's hand stilled. He looked into the fire, his gaze distant. "He was a good man," he said, the words heavy with emotion. "He was working to clear the debt when a storm hit. He was out on the range, and he never came back." His voice cracked with a grief that still felt raw. He told her of their plans, of the dreams they had shared for the ranch. He spoke of his guilt, the heavy burden he carried, the feeling that he had failed to protect his brother. Amelia listened, her heart aching for the lonely, hurting man before her. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy answers. Instead, she simply said, "He would have been proud of you, Caleb. Look at what you've done." He looked at her, his eyes, so often guarded, now filled with a vulnerability she had never seen. In that moment a bond was forged, a connection born of shared sorrow and unspoken understanding. The ghost of Samuel O'Malley had finally begun to fade, and a new, more powerful force was starting to take its place. The storm passed, leaving the ranch shrouded in a cold, unforgiving landscape. The Millers, however, had not forgotten their threat. They began to harass Caleb and Amelia, cutting fences, scattering their cattle, and leaving menacing messages scrawled on the barn doors. The attacks, though minor, were a constant drain on their time and energy, a relentless psychological assault. One afternoon, Caleb returned from town with a grim expression. "Jed Miller said he's going to the bank to call in the loan," he said, his voice flat. "He's going to try to buy it out from under me." The news was a devastating blow. The loan was a last resort, a desperate attempt to keep the ranch afloat after Samuel's passing. Without it, they were finished. Amelia saw the defeat in his eyes, the weariness that had settled deep in his bones, but she also saw a way forward. "How much do we have?" she asked, her mind already working. Caleb looked at her, surprised by her resolve. "Not enough," he said. "It will take months to get the rest." She shook her head. "We don't have months, but we have a plan." She told him about a small inheritance her family had left her, a sum she had saved for her new life. "It's not enough to pay off the debt, but it's enough to buy us time. We can sell the cattle, and we can start prospecting for gold in the hills." Caleb looked at her, his heart full of a feeling he couldn't name. It was more than gratitude. It was an awe for the woman who stood before him, ready to sacrifice everything for a man she barely knew. They were no longer two separate people. They were a team, a partnership bound by shared burden and a common goal. With Amelia's money, they were able to stave off the bank for a few more months. The cattle were sold, and the immediate threat of foreclosure was averted. But the long-term solution lay in the hills, in the promise of gold. They began their prospecting journey, their days a blur of shoveling earth, panning in the cold creek water, and camping under the vast, star-filled sky. The work was backbreaking, but they worked side by side, their movements in sync. The days were long and filled with a quiet camaraderie. They spoke of their pasts, of their dreams, of the lives they had left behind. Amelia told him of her stifling life in the city, of the arranged marriage she had fled. Caleb told her of his family, of the love and loss that had shaped him. In the stillness of the wilderness, their walls began to crumble. One evening, as the campfire crackled, Amelia found a small nugget of gold in her pan. It was small, a speck of promise in a sea of dirt, but it was enough. It was a sign. "We can do this," she said, her voice filled with hope. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. He didn't just see a beautiful woman. He saw a partner, a friend, and something more, something deeper that he was too afraid to name. Their luck began to turn. The small nuggets turned into larger ones, and their sacks of gold dust grew heavier. They were closer than ever to paying off the debt, to securing their future, but their success had not gone unnoticed. Jed Miller, a man consumed by jealousy and greed, had been watching them. He saw the prospect of their success as a direct threat to his plan to seize the O'Malley land. He gathered his brothers and a few hired thugs, and they planned an ambush. They struck on a cold, foggy morning as Caleb and Amelia were packing up their camp. The sound of gunshots echoed through the valley, and Caleb shoved Amelia behind a large boulder. "Stay here!" he yelled, his voice a low command. He returned fire, his movements quick and precise. But they were outnumbered. Silas Miller managed to get a clear shot, and the bullet tore through Caleb's left shoulder. He fell to the ground, his gun slipping from his grasp. Amelia, her heart pounding in her chest, saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. She had been a city girl, but her spirit was forged in the fire of her own independence. She had not come to the West to be a damsel in distress. She grabbed a rock and, with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, she ran toward the closest of the thugs, catching him by surprise. He stumbled, and she grabbed Caleb's gun, pointing it at the Miller brothers. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. "Get out of here," she screamed, "or I'll shoot." Jed, surprised by her strength and audacity, looked from her to his fallen men and then back to her. He saw the determination in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in her on the porch. He made a calculated decision. "This isn't over, O'Malley," he snarled, and with a final hateful glare, he and his remaining men rode off, leaving behind a trail of blood and the broken silence of the valley. The air was a biting cold, and the silence was broken only by the low groans Caleb couldn't suppress. The bullet had ripped through his shoulder, and a crimson stain bloomed across his shirt, a stark, terrifying splash of color against the pale landscape. Amelia's face was a mask of grim determination. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, the fine cotton a bizarre contrast to the raw reality of the moment, and wrapped it tightly around his wound, her fingers surprisingly strong and steady. "Hold on, Caleb," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. Getting him onto the horse was a brutal, agonizing struggle. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, and the world swam in and out of focus. But Amelia's grip was unyielding. She propped him up, her smaller frame straining with the effort, and then, taking the reins, she guided his horse while leading her own. The journey back to the cabin was a living nightmare, a slow, torturous march against the unforgiving terrain. He leaned heavily on his saddle horn, his vision blurring, but every time he felt himself slipping, he felt her hand on his arm, a gentle but firm anchor. Back at the cabin, she moved with the efficiency of a seasoned nurse. She built up the fire to a roaring blaze, the heat a welcome relief. She boiled water and sterilized a knife and a needle, the tools of her grim task. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice soft but direct, her eyes meeting his. He simply nodded, biting down on a leather strap. She made a small incision, and with an almost surgical precision, she worked the bullet free. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that stole his breath. But he didn't cry out. He watched her face, pale but focused, and a new kind of strength, one he had never known before, began to take hold. It was the strength of letting someone else carry your burden. For the next week, he was helpless, and she was his sole provider. She bathed his wound, changed the dressings, and fed him broth. She was a constant, comforting presence, her hand on his brow, her low, soothing words a balm to his fevered mind. He, the man who had always prided himself on his independence, was now completely dependent on the woman he had sent for as a matter of necessity. He saw the care in her eyes, the worry that creased her brow when he was at his worst, the quiet joy when his fever finally broke. He saw the heart of the woman he had underestimated, and in the quiet moments of his recovery, he finally understood. His strength had always been about fighting alone. Her strength was about fighting together. It was a profound lesson, and it was a gift. As Caleb's strength returned, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. The physical pain had receded, replaced by a deep emotional vulnerability. He sat by the fire one evening, the flames dancing in the hearth, and a wave of honesty washed over him. Amelia was mending a blanket, the rhythmic movement of her hands a peaceful sound. He reached out and took her hand, his touch no longer hesitant, but firm and certain. "Amelia," he began, his voice raw with emotion, "I have to tell you something. When I wrote that letter, I was a desperate man. I was broken. I had lost my brother, the ranch was falling apart, and I was drowning in grief and debt." He looked at her, his eyes full of a truth he had been hiding for so long. "I thought I needed a wife to fill a void, to cook, to clean, to help with the ranch. I didn't think I had a heart left to give, and I certainly didn't expect to find one. A tear slipped down his weathered cheek. "But you came. You didn't just mend a leaking roof or fix a broken fence. You didn't just save my ranch. You helped me heal. You brought a light back into this place that I thought was lost forever, and you brought a light back into me." Amelia's eyes welled with tears, and she gently squeezed his hand. "I came here to find a new life," she said, her voice a soft whisper that was barely audible above the crackling fire. "I was tired of being told who to be and who to marry. I wanted a place where I could be strong, where I could be useful." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I found more than that, Caleb. I found a home, not just in this cabin, but in you. I found a partner who shares my burdens and celebrates my triumphs. I found a love I never dared to hope for. I found you." He pulled her into a fierce, tight embrace, and the last of the walls he had built around his heart finally crumbled to dust. In that moment, the unspoken promise was made. They would face the future not as two desperate souls, but as one united force. They spoke of their dreams, of clearing the debt, of rebuilding the ranch, of a future filled with children and laughter. The threats from the Miller brothers, once a suffocating weight, now seemed like a distant, solvable problem, a mere obstacle on the path to their shared dream. The final journey into redemption was unlike any before. As they rode side by side, the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken grief or uncertainty. It was filled with a quiet joy, a shared sense of purpose. With the gold they had collected and the last of the money from the cattle, they walked into the bank, their shoulders squared with a new confidence. Caleb handed the sack of gold dust and the bills to the banker, a man who had always seen him as a failing man with a doomed ranch. But today, the banker looked at him with a newfound respect. The debt was paid. The O'Malley ranch was safe. As they stepped out onto the dusty street, a sense of profound relief washed over them. Just then, they saw Jed Miller standing across the way. He had been waiting, watching, his face a mask of smug anticipation. He had expected to see Caleb broken, defeated. But he saw a different man, a man standing taller, his arm around the waist of the woman who had helped him defeat his enemy. Jed's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief and rage. He had lost. He had not only underestimated Caleb, he had utterly failed to comprehend the power of the woman who stood beside him. With a final furious glare, he turned and stomped away, his power and influence broken. The journey back to the ranch was filled with the promise of a new dawn. The setting sun painted the sky in a blaze of orange and purple, a fitting end to their trial. The landscape, once so vast and unforgiving, now seemed like a beautiful blank canvas for their future. They had faced down a threat, healed a wound, and found a love they never expected. As they rode toward the setting sun, Caleb looked at Amelia, his heart full. He had sent for a girl to fill an empty house, a frail presence to protect. But the strong beauty who had come had not only saved his ranch, she had shaken his soul, opened his heart, and taught him that the most profound love often arrives not as a simple solution, but as a quiet, courageous partnership. The O'Malley Ranch was no longer a monument to a past grief. It was a testament to a new beginning, a new horizon, and the enduring power of a love forged in the crucible of the American West.